countries. So you can see my friend here, Dani, this is where she was living when I met her, when I first began working in Haiti. This is her house in what was known as a tent city. So the reason that we've decided to focus on low resource areas is because that's where the highest need is for prosthetic care in the world. About 80% of people who live with disability live in low resource regions of the world, and the World Health Organization estimates that about only 5 to 15% of folks that could benefit from prosthetic and rehabilitative care actually have access to it. And to me, that's just, it's not acceptable. I want to do something about that. So that's why I'm doing the research in the area that I'm doing research in. So the reason why there's higher needs for prosthetic care in these areas is because there's just not the same level of infrastructure there for basic needs. So this could relate to healthcare infrastructure. For instance, if there aren't very many healthcare facilities in an area, then things like just little minor cuts on your finger, if that cut got infected and the person couldn't get to a healthcare facility to get care for that infection could lead to an amputation. Things like not having economic capacity to fix roads, to fix cars, to fix equipment for working. If these things aren't maintained, that means there's more accidents that happen, and more accidents means there's more amputations that occur. So also one thing that I was very surprised when I began working in Haiti, the electrical grid is such that you see high tension wires sort of dangling in areas where children are playing and things like this often. There's high incidence of electrocution, and when people actually are, lucky enough to survive these incidences, a lot of amputations occur. So all of these things sort of combine to mean that there's just a lot of amputations. But when you're thinking about situations where you're in a war zone or you're in a disaster area like Haiti, you might have the few, hospitals that exist, or the few healthcare facilities, that exist are destroyed, in these situations. And this photo here is actually a picture of the Healing Hands for Haiti clinic back in 2010, January 12th, 2010. There was a very awful earthquake, and this was once a 6-story building. And this happened in the afternoon when people were at work. So there were, clinicians working to get people into prosthetics and orthotics working there, and many of them did not survive. So I mean, obviously that's, awful on its own, but it's also awful because now there are even less, there's even less ability to serve people that have a prosthetic need in this area. And this is my friend Jean. He was one of 6 people to survive while he was working that day as a custodian in the clinic. Beyond, the hospitals and being destroyed and the clinicians being killed, there's less training opportunities available to get clinical expertise generally in these areas. So, sort of replenishing that system takes quite a long time. So you have this horrible combination of, a high needs and very low resources to serve that need. So, when you think about this, why use 3D printing, particularly low cost 3D printing in these areas to create prosthetics? Well, in my experience in Haiti, working with prosthetists there, in the new Healing Hands for Haiti clinic that was rebuilt after the earthquake, these systems require a lot less equipment and materials than the large ovens and various grinders and vacuum formers and things like that than the traditional means for manufacturing prosthetics did. It takes quite a bit less materials, So the materials cost is considerably lower, doesn't take as much electricity. Basically running one of these printers is kind of like running a microwave as opposed to running very large ovens all day long. This gets expensive for them. And the clinic only has electricity for 6 or 7 hours a day, typically. So electricity is important. This process actually speeds up the process of making a prosthetic. When the stars align and everything goes well, a person could actually come in the morning, get their residual limb 3D scanned, have prosthetic socket adjusted and fit to them, all the parts of the prosthetic printed out, all during one day. They could leave with a prosthetic same day, which is very important for people who may have mobility issues and may have to travel very far to get to a clinic in the first place. So definitely speeds up the process when things work right. I'll put that in there. That is not always the case. But I think very importantly, 3D technologies really support customization. And this is super important. If there are any prosthetists in the audience, which I suspect there may be, you know that each of these devices needs to be very patient specific. So you have to create, especially the sockets have to be adjusted to a person's individual anatomy. Keeping in mind their bone structure, you want to pull away that socket from, bony prominences, or, press in on soft tissue. Don't want to press too hard on areas that might have, involve circulation, blood flow, and things like that. You don't want to injure neuromas and all of these different considerations that you have when fitting devices. So essentially it's kind of a one-off kind of device that you are making. So you want to be able to use a process that is low cost for doing that. So if you look at this graph, this sort of explains a little bit how additive manufacturing or 3D printing sort of compares to subtractive manufacturing, things like CNC milling or CNC lathe or injection molding. When considering how many parts you need to make. So if you are only making one part specific to a patient, you have a low amount of parts here, and the cost per part using these different means, you can see that additive manufacturing is much less as far as cost per part. So that's definitely a benefit. If you're making, 10,000 parts, then, subtractive manufacturing, injection molding starts to become more interesting for sure. But the setup costs are very high for those methods of manufacturing otherwise. Whereas additive manufacturing stays about the same, no matter how many parts you make. So that's very attractive if you want to make just one part. But I'm not selling something. It's not all rose water here. There are issues with FFF 3D printing. Anyone in the audience who has printed anything on them probably already has had some experience with this. But some of the things that you really need to think about when you're thinking about design for 3D printing with these systems is something called anisotropy. So essentially, when a 3D printer, it's kind of like wood grain, how wood grain sort of has these layers. The strength is different for a 3D printed part depending on the orientation that part is printed in. Basically, a 3D printer will lay down a layer of material. That material will start to cool as the next layer is laid on top of it. That layer begins to cool, the next layer gets laid down, so on and so forth. So as each layer begins to cool, the outside of that layer cools faster than the inside of the layer does. And so what happens is that material begins to sort of pull in on itself, and it creates, between these layer lines, it creates these areas where there's a high stress. So if a part is going to break, oftentimes it's going to break between those layer lines. So essentially, if you were to print, this is kind of simplistic, but if you were to print a finger in two different directions, on a 3D print bed, if you were to print it in this direction with the layer lines going this way, it's going to be about 5 times stronger than if you printed with the layer lines that way. So it matters for strength. So this is something that expertise in 3D printing can help you make prints stronger. But this is, completely complex. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. I'm sure you're very disappointed. But if you have questions about any of these, I can certainly talk about that later during question time. But so there's a lot of different factors when you're considering this kind of fused filament 3D printing that can have positive or negative effects on strength. And so some of these very generally have to do with what type of printer you're using, what type of filament you're using. Some materials have better strength in general, higher strength than others, and different kinds of strength is a factor. Some materials like nylon, for instance, when you're printing with nylon, it tends to really collect moisture. If you're thinking about 3D printing, the filaments coming out of a hot nozzle, that nozzle is hotter than 100 degrees Celsius when you're printing these materials. So essentially you're boiling any of that trapped moisture, which then, you have all these tiny little pores and bubbles that can be in your part and cause surface roughness. Any of that surface roughness, any of the divots in the surface can be points of stress concentration that can then be parts, that if, that's where a break is going to start, so in a part. So there's just a lot to think about. Part geometry itself can strengthen or weaken a part. And there are a number of user specified print parameters that can have different effects on a part's strength. So when you're thinking about designing parts for prosthetics that are going to be 3D printed, using FFF printers, really got to account for all of these factors within the design. So, prosthetists already have an expertise. So if your goal, like mine, is to create device designs that can be made 3D printed by clinicians in these areas, then they shouldn't have to learn a new expertise in 3D printing. They shouldn't have to know all of these different variables in order to just leverage the technology to create these devices. So part of designing these prosthetic parts is to sort of bake the engineering requirements into that design in a way. It's really good to have that. It's kind of been, in my experience, it's been a nice exchange, I guess, of knowledge. So I've been working with some CPOs, prosthetists, orthotists in Haiti, and they have given me just a wealth of information on clinical needs for devices, and I have tried to give them more information on, 3D printing and CAD and, sort of the engineering aspects. And so really co-designing in that way has been beneficial to everyone. So some of the things, that the socket portion of the prosthetic and why it's so, critical, I think, the most critical part of the prosthetic that really needs to be fitted by a clinician is because it really serves a lot of purposes. And so, this visual over here shows the socket. The person's residual limb fits into the individually fitted socket, and that socket then goes into sort of the prosthetic extension. So what that socket does, its job is to, really stabilize the prosthetic on the body, also to prevent injury, because, if the prosthetic isn't stable on the body and isn't fitted correctly, it's going to move around, it might twist. If this is a lower limb amputation and you have twisting and somebody's, traversing a hill or stairs, this could be pretty bad. So that's important. Sockets also can prevent tissue damage. Designing a socket so that it has a flare at the top, it isn't just for comfort. It can also, prevent that tissue damage. there. It's also there to improve utility so that when a person intends to move, that force is translated into device movement in the way it should. And it's meant to increase comfort, hopefully, so that people don't abandon their devices. You know, what's the point then if they don't, if they want a prosthetic and they don't actually wear it? And in some cases, compression release systems there, they account for some of the daily volume fluctuations and residual limbs, which is something that happens. Okay, and this brings us to some of my current research. So as I said a little bit earlier, I am doing a lot of research involved with the socket and the cushioning within the socket using lattice structures. So some of the things that I have been working on here are creating basically different unit cells to create lattice structures and testing them to find out which ones can serve properly the purpose of creating areas where the prosthetic socket will compress against a person's soft tissue or provide a more sparse lattice where a person's soft tissue can then release into a more open area. So you can, you know, get that stability and that function there. And so what I've been working on is actually density graded lattice structures. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but what that means is that in altering the density of that lattice structure, that's how you can get the functionality that you want in different areas of that socket. And what I've been doing is trying to create a workflow so that a clinician could essentially use color in a 3D software platform to color the areas where, specific to their patient, they want areas to be more compressed into the tissue, and color in a different color areas that they want there to be more release. And so using those colors, we can translate the colors into math that controls the density of the lattice structures in those areas. So essentially, it's a way for a clinician to continue to use a workflow that they're used to. They're used to marking areas where they need to press in on the socket and pull away on the socket. So that can be translated into how dense a lattice structure for padding in that socket is. So hopefully, at least I've gotten sort of across the point that the needs for prosthetic design are very complex. There's a lot to it. It's more than just engineering needs. It's more than just clinical needs that we've touched on briefly. There's environmental needs, sociocultural needs, economical needs, needs of the supply chain, and certainly very personal individual needs of the person who's going to be wearing the prosthetic. So we really want to think, when we think design for devices like this,